Hello and welcome to StratCom Talks, our online events that we've been carrying out since March of the last year, where we explore strategic communications from different aspects. Last week we talked about protecting the military in the digital domain, and thank you all who were joining us and leaving your comments and questions. We are really happy to see that these issues and different aspects of strategic communications really reach out to broad audiences and are interesting to many people also working from in the academia and the private sector and in the government sector. And especially we're happy actually to see people coming back to our events again and again and giving their inputs. And today we are going to talk about Japan's approach to strategic communications. This is one of the themes that actually first arose for NATO Strategic Communications Center Excellence in the academic journal that we have. Our academic journal is called Defense Strategic Communications, and in 2017 we had an article about Japan's approach to strategic communications, and later on we also had a book review essay by one of the speakers that we are going to have here today as well, Nancy Snow, where she looked at the same topic from a bit different perspective. And it's very important for us to not only look at the Euro-Atlantic space, but also at the more global scale. And we are really excited to have this event today. So let me introduce you to our speakers. First speaker is Nancy Snow, and the second speaker is Kyoko Kuahara. So Nancy is a Pax Monday professor, and she has been speaking about strategic communications from different perspectives for quite a while, and also she is one of the professors writing a lot about public diplomacy and about Japan's storytelling to the world. Nancy, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Great, thank you. Thank you for being here. I know that in Tokyo it's really late, although it
Yes.
by the background it seems that sun is rising, I guess.
Well, there's a story. Speaking of telling Japan's story to the world, this is in fact the beautiful campus of the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology Graduate School. It is not a live shot, so it's a way to feel like it's morning as opposed to late at night.
Yeah, so you will be the first speaker at our event, and you have lately actually been very present in different media outlets, speaking also about Japan's response to COVID-19 crisis. So I will give the floor to you to talk about Japan's approach to StratCom.
Well, you know what? This is actually a great sign that we're having this discussion now. And I'm reminded of that apocryphal moment when Mahatma Gandhi was asked, when he arrived to Great Britain, he was asked in 1930 by a reporter, what do you think of modern civilization? And his reply was, I think it's a good idea. So if you were to ask me, what do you think of Japan's strategic communication? I might answer it the same way. I think it's a good idea. In other words, it's not really a set architecture, but rather an ideal. And Japan, to have on Kyoko Kuahara here from the Japan Institute of International Affairs, that's also a good sign because she's a new fellow in public diplomacy. There's a recognition in Japan that the global spotlight, it's heating up. And it's not just related to Tokyo 2020. For many years, that's what we all talked about. but now with the postponement, and then of course with COVID, the obvious, now it's shifting more to how Japan is handling the communications, the messaging around the COVID crisis, and as of today, the distribution of the vaccine. This is, I think they had the first person went on camera today, the visual showing the Japanese person receiving the vaccine. This is 2 months after most all of the developed countries have had the vaccine. So it's been a very slow rollout. And I think people have been rather curious about this because Japan wants to give a message to the world that it's safe and it's ready to receive the international athletes who are expected here just 5 months or so from now. And yet to do this rollout so late, it's causing some sense of maybe being alarmed. But I also wanted to address what I think has been in headlines of late, and it's also something that grabs global attention. And it's part of what I often call the 3Gs of nation brand Japan. I've been using that phrase for many, many years. Generation, globalization, and the obvious gender. And just in the last week, we've seen this kerfuffle around the former Prime Minister Mori having to resign because of the now very well-known comments he made that women were talking and kind of wasting time in these meetings. And to add to this bit of a debacle, now the LDP announced with some fanfare that they were going to have women join the top leadership meetings. I think this was just released today. This came out, and of course it went global. It grew legs and went global. But that the women who were appointed to the LDP leadership, because they weren't elected to the leadership, they could not speak in the meetings. So it's they're allowed to share their opinion following the meetings. And this has not played well in the global media information sphere. So what happens is that there's a tendency that I've noticed living here in Japan that when the global spotlight gets too hot, there's sort of a turning inward and sometimes not explaining oneself. And that's never good when you're trying to do strategic communications. I've noted in my book, Japan's Information War, and many of my writings that Japan does not handle often criticism from either foreign media or outside observers. Now, this sensitivity to criticism isn't particularly unique to Japan. All nations prefer a good image over a bad image. But as the world's third largest economy, as a member of the G7, as one of the leading developed economies, one of the most literate populations, the expectations are much higher for Japan. And so this makes the messaging all the more important. But instead of really getting effective messaging, we seem to kind of hop from one political mishap to another instead of really getting a sense of the strategy. I'll give you another, I'm just sort of, speaking off the top of my head now, but when I returned to Japan after sheltering in place in the United States for most of 2020, I returned to Japan in the fall at just the time when the COVID numbers were still very low. So it looked like things were going along smoothly, and the government promoted this Go To Travel campaign. And people let down their guard and they moved about Japan because the foreigners, the tourists, are not allowed to come in. So this was a domestic travel campaign. Well, now we know that that was a reopening of Japan that was too soon to make. And it was a bit of perhaps overconfidence. It was a bit of maybe thinking that Japan isn't like what's happening outside Japan vis-a-vis the COVID numbers. And inevitably, we saw the numbers spike, and then the issuing of the state of emergency took place, and we're still under that now. So it was sort of missing this this opportunity to really kind of keep people vigilant. And perhaps it was because the feeling was that, well, the Japanese people, they had the habits, the social mores, the tradition of really protecting themselves and engaging in this social contract with each other and being mindful and respectful of wearing the mask. And we've been hearing about that all year. But now Japan is looking like it hasn't handled this very effectively. And Suga, in terms of strategic communication, went before the World Economic Forum and said, we're going to go ahead and host the Olympics because we want to show the world that we've sort of put COVID behind us, you know, that we've overcome COVID, and it's kind of a reopening of the world. Well, we know COVID-19 isn't going away anytime soon. It's here to stay for quite some time. So if I were to reframe that message, I might have said, we'd like to host the Olympics as a reprieve from COVID-19, as a bit of a distraction, as a way to bring people together, instead of making this overreach, this promise that somehow Japan hosting the Olympics in July and August will be sort of the end of the worst aspects of COVID-19. So I think that Japan needs to recognize that today's global information environment is a competition for the eyes and the ears of the world, and these consequences are immediate. So in terms of global spokespeople, to assign Mori, the 83-year-old, you know, the octogenarian old schooler, to be kind of the face of the Olympics isn't going to work, because you're trying to really engage a global marketplace. And he may be somebody who has the right title and the seniority, but that doesn't mean it's an effective person to really channel the right messaging. And we know already that, you know, with this recent debacle about women being too talkative, I just wanted to mention that this has a lot to do with the lack of political empowerment for women in Japan. So it seems to me that if you had more equity and equality between the sexes in Japan, you would have more of an ability to account for women participating and actively engaging through speaking, through debating. They would be there at the table. But right now, because there are so few representatives, there aren't good role models there. And so women are still sort of being cast as better to be seen and not heard. Now, where I'm from in the United States, that's usually in reference to children. And but we've got to acknowledge, and Japan really has to be on the alert now more than ever, that women are have to be part of the global conversation. And interestingly, in terms of gender diplomacy now too, Linda, about 60 to 70% of the participants in study abroad are females who leave Japan. And this is sort of a niche of the market in terms of discourse, dialogue, and contribution to the conversation. These women who return to Japan, they've had an experience that's very valuable, and I don't think they're being heard from. And I would also, of course, bring in the young male students who go abroad, but it's overwhelmingly women and young women who go abroad. And there's a reason for that. There's some rationale that is kind of a pull factor from overseas that takes them overseas, where they find that they are actually asked for their point of view. They are asked to speak up in the classroom, and they become comfortable hearing their voices. And then when they return to Japan, they see the leadership at the very top saying, you talk too much or you take too much time. A year ago, it was women were taking too much time shopping at the beginning of the COVID crisis. I think that was the mayor of Osaka. So these sort of stereotypes, these sexual stereotypes are, outmoded, and there has to be kind of an engagement, again, not with women and men, but also with having internationals who live here to be engaged beyond just being critics. I don't like to be a continual critic. I could talk to you for quite a while about all the great attributes of Japan, but there are plenty of people who can take on that role. And my function is to serve more as a bridge builder. I'm helping Japan to sort of build bridges to the global English-speaking world, because most people in the world do not speak Japanese, but they are naturally curious about Japan, and they have a natural affinity for Japan. So they're very open to the stories that come out of Japan, and they would be very receptive to learning more about how Japan is changing, how it's becoming more of a, reducing this gender inequality gap and so on. So I think I'll just stop there, because I could go on for some time.
Thank you, Nancy. And well, so probably Japan's brand has changed due to COVID-19 crisis, and you've been very critical. You had an article that talked about the response towards the crisis on Diamond Princess, about canceling or timing of canceling the Olympic Games. And in Chuki's article, she talks about narratives that Japan is kind of conveying to the outer world, and one of them is proactive contribution to peace. So what would be your take on Japan's brand or messages that the other countries in the world see from their standpoint?
I think the peace brand is still really strong. It's just that we're now in the shift to crisis communications, because there was this phase of Japan hosting the G7, hosting the G20, of course, having the Rugby World Cup here in 2019. So there was this momentum. There was this rise of nearly 32 million international visitors to Japan at the end of 2019, with the projection of 40 million, 50 million in the next years to come. So it seemed like things were rolling along, the Reiwa, the new era and the new emperor and empress. A lot of positive messaging there. But unfortunately, every country has had to reassess now its image going forward. And I think where Japan can be really helpful to the world, and I think this is part of its own self-image too, is being more of a collaborator and a cooperative partner, a reliable partner. When I think of what resonates with my students in the classroom, my Japanese students, so many of them like to address issues related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the green economy, this sort of balance between nature and modern civilization, trying to protect the environment, protect the seas. And I think there's a lot of promise there. It's just that we are under a lot of stress now. And again, it's not unique to Japan. I have to say this has been a very busy media day because it was also announced that there would be a new minister to tackle loneliness due to the rising suicide rate related to the COVID crisis. So I think that there's more of a recognition now that people are suffering, and there's a sensitivity to suffering here and to trying to kind of contribute to a better world. I had no idea before I moved to Japan how really supportive of the United Nations and the kind of UN movement and building a global civil society this country was committed to. But it makes a lot of sense, though, when you come here, because it's a country that has changed a lot from the 20th century to today. So I think the more that you can tap into that enthusiasm of the youth, what I mentioned earlier with these gender diplomats coming out of Japan, it will give it a new sense of dynamism. Because the thing about COVID-19, it sort of kind of languishes there, and it's not something that's tangible, but it's threatening and we fear it. And so we sort of feel like we're in this inertia. We're not moving forward, but we're always moving forward. We've got to keep asking questions. We've got to keep kind of checking ourselves, auditing ourselves. And I think Japan is quite capable of that. Should the Olympics happen, I think they will go off very well because I think the country is prepared well for that. But again, that's a bit of a question mark right now too. Maybe Kyoko can weigh in on that.
Yes, I think it's really time to bring in Kyoko, especially in the context of you beforehand saying about women being too talkative, and here we are, clearly two talkative women. And let me introduce our listeners and viewers to Kyoko Kuahara. She is a research fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, and she's also a research fellow at the Institute for Future Engineering and a specially appointed assistant professor at Kyoto University. Her most recent books are written in Japanese, but they include Why is Japan's Righteousness Difficult to Convey to the World? The Fierce Image Competition Between Japan, China and South Korea. And another book is After Sharp Power, The Dawn of the New Cold War Between the US and China. Dear Kyoko, thank you so much for being here at this late time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Such a great opportunity to discuss Japan's public diplomacy or strategic communication with you, Linda, and also Dr. Nancy Snow. I am Kyoko Kuahara, research fellow at Japan Institute of International Affairs.
So Kyoko, probably sorry, Kyoko, you probably were listening also to Nancy's presentation, and now I know you have your own. So yeah, let me give floor to you.
Okay, thank you. So we have limited time, so let me start my presentation about the overview of Japan's strategic communication toward its effective strategies. So would you go on to the next page, please? Thank you. There are many discussions about strategic communication. The definition is yet to be established. Information warfare and public diplomacy are important components of strategic communication. So when thinking about Japan's strategic communication, there's one point I would like to reconfirm. Japan's strategic communication is closely related to public diplomacy, and we cannot clearly understand the Japan's strategic communication without understanding the public diplomacy. So in the background of Japan's awareness of importance of strategic communication or public diplomacy, there are some environmental changes surrounding Japan. For instance, with the advancement of the globalization and rapid development of information technology, global public opinion has gained importance in the global policymaking process. Many countries, including China, understand these phenomena well and have increased its information warfare and political warfare and communication activities in the world. And also there were some aggressive strategic communication activities and efforts conducted by Japan's neighboring countries, criticizing Japan on territorial issues and historical recognitions in the United States and other countries. So let's go on to the next slide. And United States has become one of the battlegrounds of the information warfare conducted by other countries. So with the awareness of the importance of strategic communication under the second Abe administration between 2012 and 2020, Japan increased its communication budget by 50 billion yen, which was about 50 million US dollars, bringing the total to about 70 million US dollars per year in order to enhance Japan's profile and achieve proper understanding regarding its various positions in the world. And Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan launched various of new projects, including the initiation of communication activities, cooperating with foreign press, foreign think tanks, and so forth. Also, Japan House is one of the brand new projects conducted by and managed by Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and located in international communities in 3 cities, London, Los Angeles, and Sao Paulo. In that way, Japan has paid a lot of attention and efforts to strategic communication, but it tends to rely on or strongly rely on soft power approaches, and the concept of strategic communication has yet to be established also in Japan as well. And let's go on to the next slide. So now I'd like to point out that there are some trends surrounding Japan's strategic communication, in particular, Chinese activities. China has embarked on aggressive and hardline foreign conduct, so-called warfare diplomacy. And these Chinese aggressive actions have resulted in aggravation of Chinese image in the world. According to the Pew Research Center survey, which was conducted last year, for instance, so negative views increased in many developed countries, including many of European countries. In short, we could say that the Chinese approach is not functioning to improve its image in the world, and rather it has worked to damage its image. So why is it, and what is taking place in the Chinese communication efforts? In my understanding, the Chinese hardline foreign conducts derived from 2 elements. So one, it's major country syndrome, and the other, a sense of insecurity about outside China. We can come back here later to talk more about these 2 elements if you want. And also COVID-19 has a huge game changer, and the policy priorities are changing in many countries, as Dr. Nancy said before. And also, the pandemic has led to the spread of disinformation campaign, and the social media tends to proliferate these trends. And disinformation threatens to shape the very foundation of our democracy. So how should Japan's strategic communication for this era be considered? So strategic communication should be a combination of all approaches in general. So not just about diplomatic or cultural approaches. In this regard, Japan's strategies should be supported by common, broader interagency efforts. But it is quite challenging for Japan to secure that the cooperation among varied agencies. Also, at the same time, there are some promising developments globally for more collaboration and cooperation among like-minded countries, including many European countries. For instance, Japan is promoting free and open Indo-Pacific Ocean, which is called FOIP concept. And Japan must take a leadership or can take a leadership role in the Indo-Pacific to maintain rule-based international order and reach out to related countries, including the United States or European nations and countries. And regarding challenging theme of disinformation campaign, we can also seek an opportunity to conduct joint research and information sharing to develop for instance, the system to counter the disinformation campaign and to maintain the rule-based international order. So I will end my presentation here and like to discuss deeper these points with Linda and Dr. Nassisno. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyoko. I have one question. You also actually mentioned China, and sometimes it's being said that Japan's strategic communication is actually driven by China's presence and China's influence activities. And we've had quite a few events where we were discussing China's activities in the Nordic Baltic environment and globally. Can you comment a bit about China and disinformation in the context of Japan?
Okay, so regarding Chinese activities, in my understanding, the current theme of China's public opinion campaign or disinformation campaign, I would say China's public opinion campaign in the United States, for instance, Japan's strategic allies, and is to keep the United States from using military force and to remove its economic sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. China believes that the Biden administration represents that the establishment and that it can achieve its goals, China's goals, by strengthening its public opinion campaign against the United States, for instance, business community. So China tries to conduct an effective strategic communication over disinformation campaign against the United States, and also regarding the Senkaku Island. Now the one of the hot topics in Japan. Let me explain what's going on among China and Japan over Senkaku Island. China passed a new law this month that allows its Coast Guard to use a military force on foreign vessels around the Senkaku Island in the East China Sea. So now Japan is worried about Chinese aggressive activities because China could use the Chinese Coast Guard law as its legal basis to make a forced landing on the Senkaku Island. So I'm not a specialist of the international law, but among my understandings, China will never give up Senkaku Island. But the enactment of a new law doesn't necessarily mean that China will soon take it by force. In the international law, the lines between the use of force and the exercise of executive jurisdiction is unclear. the enactment of the Chinese new law as a domestic law was essential for China, so that if China used weapons against Japanese ships or vessels, China could argue that the action was based on its domestic law and did not constitute the use of force. Also, China understands that must make the international community aware that the water around the Senkaku Island are not disputed territory, but under the Chinese jurisdiction. So in order to do so, China might step up its activities on the Senkaku Island, and also its international public opinion manipulation, including the United States and also Japanese public opinion. So Japan should send a strong message against China, and now China's activities has entered into the next stage, and Japan will respond in accordance with the robust international order. So about the relationship with the United States, Japan should send a message to the United States how important the Senkaku Island are for the regional peace and security, and for the Japan-U.S. alliance, and also Japan and U.S. and other countries alliance. So we must make sure that think how to counter the information campaign and disinformation campaign, and also we have a lot of choice to cooperate with European countries to counter the disinformation campaign. This is my opinion about the recent trends of disinformation campaign.
Yes, thank you, Kyoko. And that's also one of the comments that we have in the live stream about the necessity and importance of taking Chinese military presence in the region very seriously, and the importance of allies in securing the region. One of the questions that I have here, and I think that would be probably for Nancy. So in the context of communicating the new Indo-Pacific priority, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Japan's image in the Southeast Asia and the Pacific?
Yeah, I'm glad it was a question about communication because ultimately I'm a fundamentalist when it comes to communication. I wanted to make a point maybe that is a little different than something specific to Southeast Asian Indo-Pacific policy, and that's this. Japan's attraction to the world is not based on disputed islands. I've been going to government ministries and sitting in on briefings, and I've heard about Senkaku and other disputed islands, or what China might be up to in Southeast Asia. And yes, these are concerns and worries, security concerns, but ultimately you've got to magnify really what attracts people here. And what attracts people to Japan is the idea of the mix of the modern and traditional culture, the way of the people and the service that one gets here, very high quality service, the respect for the consumer, the customer and the client, and really magnify this, what the Japanese government would call omotenashi. You hear this over and over. It's sort of loosely translated as hospitality. But I think too, in reference to China, specifically, since I also teach in China at Tsinghua University, the Chinese have an enormous advantage that Japan has not yet recognized, and I don't hear this brought up enough. And that's in two areas that are really critical to public diplomacy, and that is international broadcasting and international exchanges. So by that, I mean that you have upwards of 80 to 100,000 Chinese students who come to Japan and learn all about Japan and go to some of the best universities here: Todai, the University of Tokyo, Waseda, Keio, Kyoto University, and others. And there is no reverse equal flow of Japanese students proportionally going to China. So China's been the #1 sending country for outward bound students, what we in the literature call mobility, student mobility. And this is providing a service to Chinese society and the Chinese brand, because these students are returning to China and they have a lot to share, not only about the knowledge they've gained, but the culture and and as I said, the Japanese students, it's been actually going down, the numbers of students going abroad, even though they're more female than male. The other advantage that that China has had over Japan, as I said, is international broadcasting. This month, in 2009, February 2009, NHK established NHK World Japan. So it's 24/7 English language channel. All these years later, it's barely taken off. It's nothing comparable to what China is doing with CCTV and Voice of China. Now, we can argue that the Chinese are engaging in this sort of broadcasting propaganda, but they at least are out there and investing a lot in it. And Japan is doing very little investment in making NHK World what was at one time dubbed, the CNN of Asia or the BBC of Asia. It was supposed to become that. It's fallen far short of that. I don't quite understand why that is, because NHK is quite formidable here in Japan, but it doesn't have the approach to sort of driving global media conversation the way that China is attempting to do. And I'm not saying China's always successful. In fact, they often do not get their message across, or they get a lot of pushback naturally. But Japan has to have a voice to operate as a comparable, more open society, democratic representative society in this region. It just has to have that voice, and it has to amplify that voice. And it's puzzling to me, we often point fingers at China for just being the large country that does a lot and has this influence. But if you want to compete, it's sort of like, it reminds me in my propaganda research that, every country engages in some form of propaganda. And so Harold Laswell said, the only response to propaganda that you might deem bad propaganda or their propaganda is more of your own. You've got to have your own response. But I think, of course, in many parts of the world, propaganda carries such a negative connotation. It's really on a spectrum of communication and influence. And I've never known a society or a government that didn't have a propaganda arm to it in terms of advertising and putting sort of one's best image before the global public. So I guess I'm sounding kind of a sense of urgency for Japan, that it can't continue to sort of take this study group approach and even international law. I mean, very few people really understand these disputed islands. And I'm talking about even people who live in Japan. I don't think people wake up here, worried about this. But there tends to be this narrow casting of foreign policy issues that really come from the central government and the top people in charge, whereas the people of Japan have other concerns that have to do with, just daily trying to get by. As I said, struggling, and there's more suffering now under COVID-19. So there's got to be a way to kind of connect what's happening in the hinterland and the grassroots and give the Japanese people a piece of this global communication pie, that they ought to be telling their own stories, doing more online, starting their own webcasting and blogs, so that the image isn't just controlled by those in charge. So as I say, I mean, when it comes to communication, I try to just simplify it to, if you don't like what you hear and you see out there, you go out and you do something different. You try to get your own message out there too. So one other point I wanted to make in this era of declining trust, wanted to mention the Edelman Trust Barometer, which has been around for 20 years. I don't work for Edelman, but I use it in the classroom. And Richard Edelman referred to this year, or this past year, as kind of the age of information bankruptcy. I mean, what he meant by that is that countries, we're all sort of in the same boat now. We may have different political systems, but countries are losing, those in charge are losing their credibility, and people are questioning everything and even each other. It used to be more, credible peers, and you would rely on your peers, but we're questioning our traditional institutions. There's declining trust almost across the board. And so it's never seemed so bad as now. And we've got to really, again, take a sort of do some soul searching about how can we rebuild this trust? Can we do it internationally? Can we do it through some institutions? We're questioning the World Health Organization. We're questioning the role of the UN. And can we do it through, again, youth exchanges? Well, right now, everybody's pretty much in lockdown. So that person-to-person communication is limited. So we're really challenged very much. And I think the Japan Institute of International Affairs is going to try to address this next week, right, Kyoko? Over 3 days. They're having a global dialogue.
Yes.
I don't think it's around the clock, but I wish them well with that, because again, I think we're raising more questions today than we are resolving conflicts or problems related to communication.
Thank you, Nancy. And I think that's a very great point about proactive communications and how valuable it is. Kyoko, I have a few questions from the audience that probably you would be the best person to answer, and they are connected to two players and Japan's strategic communication strategy. So one question is, does NATO have a role in Japan's StratCom strategy? How is NATO portrayed in this strategy? Well, another question is also about Taiwan and Japan's communication vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Okay, so first question, I would say I believe that the both side of Japan and also NATO have been growing expectation of each other's relations and also roles on, for instance, disinformation campaign and also each other's strategic communication activities. For instance, late January, almost months before, the Japanese Foreign Minister Motegi attended the EU Foreign Affairs Council for the first time among Japanese former prime ministers. So we have a lot of choices to work together to maintain rule-based international order and to counter the disinformation threats. And also NATO and also EU I understand that they have interest in keep and maintain the rule-based international order in free Indo-Pacific. So I would say we have some promising and expectations and also developments among Japan and NATO and also EU, many of the European countries. Also, communication with Taiwan. Maybe 5 days ago, is that correct, Nancy? We had a huge earthquake in Tohoku area and also near Tokyo area. And soon after the earthquake occurred, the Taiwan Ms. Tai Yee-gun sent a message via Twitter to she written the message in Japanese. We support Japan, and if you need us, we will help you whenever you want. She said. She tweeted in Japanese, and the messages hit many of the Japanese audience and also public opinion, and we were very happy about it, and the huge number of retweet I recognized in the Twitter, and in that way we have a lot of connections and also good relationship between Japan and Taiwan. Also, think tank at the think tank level. As I am a researcher at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, and we conduct a lot of joint events or research with Taiwan. So in the grassroots level, we can conduct some kind of joint research and also make a strong connection with through communication and also strategic communication as well.
Thank you. And another question also is about Japan's relationships with North Korea. So Japan's new prime minister agreed to meet Kim Jong-un without any conditions. And so the question is if this shows any changes in Japan's attitudes towards North Korea.
I think new Prime Minister Suga is thinks the same. Think the same thing as former Prime Minister Abe did have against North Korea. So North Korean nuclear also some serious problems among Japan also on the table on the among the conference or meeting. So I would say the Prime Minister Suga will conduct the same policy against North Korea as Mr. Prime Minister Abe had.
Thank you, Kyoko. So we have a few minutes left, and I see there's also a question about Japan House, and I'm afraid we don't have enough time to jump into this really actually large discussion about Japan's public diplomacy initiatives. But I would, to the person who is interested in that, Nancy actually went to a podcast which is iCast podcast, and they have a very lengthy discussion about Japan House and about Cool Japan, and also so I would really strongly suggest you to listen to that podcast. We will leave a comment there as well, so you can get introduced to that one. But before we finish, I would want to do a bit of future telling. If you would go in, let's say, 5 years future, and that's a question for both speakers, how would you want Japan's communication, strategic communication to the world be like? What should be the top 3 narratives? And okay, I will start with Kyoko, maybe.
Japan have been proactively conducting strategic communication activities, as I mentioned before. But again, strategic communication left a lot of arguments and discussions about its styles and activities. And Japan in particular is left behind in the conceptualization of strategy and comprehensive approaches, and is inclined on soft power approaches. So maybe the question is now arised as to what strategy Japan will take in strategic communication. So in order to enhance Japan's strategic communication efforts, further it's time for Japan to go on the proactive or offensive after its defensive stance against, for instance, China and other countries. And we need to send a message to the world that Japan abides by the international rule and protect peace and security. And also the second point is that Japan has a lot of cultural charms and also technology attractives, and we have lots of attractive soft powers. So I would say that the strategic communication of Japan should be combined by soft power approach, also security, policy and foreign conducts, and economy, and so forth. Many kind of approaches should be a combination of the Japan's strategic communication. And also about the disinformation campaign, we have a lot of choice, as I mentioned before, to conduct a joint research to counter the disinformation campaign with, for instance, many of European countries, also NATO. So I would like to point out the 3 strategic communication efforts for Japan to conduct maybe from now on. Thank you. Over to you.
Over to you, Nancy.
Yeah, I would hope in 5 years that the engagement with the world, with global publics, will be further along. The Japanese style of communication is often you go from person to person, somebody makes a point, another makes a point, but there's a foregone conclusion. So it's often predictable, it's ritualistic. It's a contrast to what happens on the global stage. On the global stage and in the global classroom, it's more chaotic, it's unwieldy. The teacher, the professor is challenged, or the professor will say, "What do you think? What do you have to say?" And that's not typical, though, in the way that we conduct business here, because that type of sort of debate and back and forth is often associated with conflict. And conflict is to be avoided, to be downplayed. That's more for behind the scenes. And so Japan is also a place that I'd like to see people tell more stories. I've often been told by the Japanese themselves that they don't attach a narrative or explanation often to, they don't put a high premium on that, explaining themselves or why they do things. So the service or the product is there to stand alone, and it stands on its own merits. It doesn't need boosterism. But yet when you live here, you know this country is awash in sponsored messaging and advertising. It's very prominent. So we have to figure out a way where you can get people, more of the Japanese people, to tell their own stories. I would also say take more risk in communication, be more comfortable with that. And the way you do that is you practice it more. There should be more media training here. There isn't enough of that. There should be more courses in public diplomacy, strategic communication, public relations. We don't have that here. So you also, again, with the recognition that the world is watching, there's no real turning back here. So figure out a way to reduce the gender gap inequalities. And really, I think, you know, my hope is that the world will get to see when we have a reopening, which inevitably we will, they will get to come here and appreciate the aspects to Japanese communication that I think should be treasured and sustained, but recognizing that Japan has to enhance its global voice, because South Korea, Taiwan, mainland China, they're doing it more. They're publishing more in international journals. You have a lot of Japanese faculty here who are not doing that type of research. And so Japan is kind of hidden from view internationally. So I hope that they will be more participatory in collaboration, like Kyoko said.
Thank you, Nancy, and well, thank you, Kyoko, and thank you, Nancy, for being so generous with your time at such a late hour. And this hour really flew by really fast, and we still have some unanswered questions. But yes, again, thank you for being here, and good night, I guess.
Thank you, and I just want to say we're 2 women in Japan, 1 Japanese, 1 American, and we're going to keep talking.
Yes. Thank you so much for your time and inviting us. Such a great opportunity.
Thank you. Well, we are going to continue with StratCom Talks also next week. And for next week, we have a very exciting conversation planned. So we are going to talk about social media platform regulation. And we have 2 speakers, Lubos Kuklis and Felix Carte. We are going to meet same place, same time. And we hope you will join us online from wherever you are. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.